There are moments in history that the camera catches by accident. Not planned, not staged, not polished for the press. Just a single unguarded second where the truth slips through and the whole world sees it whether anyone meant for them to or not. What happened on September 19, 2022 at the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II was one of those moments. Billions of people around the world were watching. Every eye, every camera, every lens was trained on Westminster Abbey and the slow, aching procession that carried the Queen to her final rest. And somewhere in the middle of all that solemn grief, on a grey London morning that felt like the end of an era, something happened near Wellington Arch that no one could fully explain. Camilla, the newly appointed Queen Consort, turned sharply. Her face shifted. Her expression became something that analysts, lip readers, body language experts, and millions of ordinary viewers around the world could not stop talking about for months. And Prince William, standing just a few feet away, caught it too. His reaction was quiet, but it was there. To understand what happened that day, and why it still matters, you have to understand the extraordinary weight that everyone was carrying into that funeral. Queen Elizabeth II had died on September 8, 2022 at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She was 96 years old and had served as the monarch of the United Kingdom for 70 years. 70 years. She had been queen longer than most of the people who mourned her had been alive. She had witnessed the Cold War, the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the internet, the passing of 15 British prime ministers, and the births of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. When she died, it did not just feel like the loss of a person. It felt like the closing of a chapter so long and so defining that the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The days between her death and her funeral were unlike anything the United Kingdom had seen in generations. More than 250,000 people lined up, some waiting over 14 hours, to walk past her coffin lying in state at Westminster Hall. The queue stretched for miles along the banks of the Thames. People stood in the dark, in the rain, in silence, waiting for their turn to pay their respects. They came from all over the country and from every corner of the world. They brought flowers. They brought photographs. They wept openly in the street, not because they had known her personally, but because she had always been there, a constant, a certainty, a fixed point in a world that never stopped changing. By the morning of September 19, the whole country had stilled. Shops closed. Trains ran quietly. Streets that would normally have been noisy and full were hushed. And at Westminster Abbey, the most important gathering of world leaders and royalty in decades was assembling to say goodbye. Inside that space, the weight was almost physical. King Charles III, newly elevated to the throne in the most raw and painful way possible, walked behind his mother's coffin with his siblings, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward, all in formal dress, all staring forward, all carrying the grief of not just children, but of an entire institution. Charles had told Prime Minister Liz Truss shortly after his mother's death that her passing had been the moment he was dreading. And now that dreaded moment had arrived, playing out in front of the entire world with no escape and no delay. AOL. Fox News. Behind Charles walked his sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. The two brothers walked side by side during the procession, together in the most public grief of their shared lives. Their relationship had become one of the most discussed and documented rifts in recent royal history. Harry had returned from California, from his new life with Meghan Markle, from the distance he had placed between himself and the institution he had grown up inside. And for one morning at least, he and William were simply two grandsons walking behind a coffin, caught between private love and the demands of a very public role. Fox News. Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, was also present that day. She arrived alongside Catherine, Princess of Wales, with Prince George and Princess Charlotte. Prince Louis, still only 4 years old, had been left at home. George and Charlotte walked with the quiet composure that their parents had clearly instilled in them. They were praised widely for it. Observers called them dignified and extraordinary for their age. But children, no matter how well prepared, are still children. That truth would reveal itself before the morning was over. AOL. The funeral service inside Westminster Abbey lasted just over an hour. Charles and Camilla sat directly behind the coffin during the service, with William and his family next to them. The Archbishop of Canterbury said that global mourning for the Queen stemmed from her life of service, and noted that very few leaders in history received such an outpouring of grief. The music was traditional and vast, filling the stone arches of the Abbey with sound that felt both ancient and alive. The coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter, sat at the front of the space while people who had known and served and loved the Queen sat in rows behind it. Fox News. Fox News. When the service ended and the procession began to move again, the family gathered outside at Wellington Arch, a grand stone structure roughly half a mile from Buckingham Palace, where the Queen's coffin was to be transferred from the gun carriage to the state hearse for the journey to Windsor Castle. It was here, in those minutes of waiting and transition, that cameras captured the moment that would later go viral and spark weeks of conversation. George and Charlotte had held themselves together with remarkable steadiness throughout the long morning. The service had gone on for hours, with the young royals seated at the front while the eyes of cameras watched them throughout the entire proceedings. But now outside, in the brief gap between formal ceremony and the hearse pulling away, something very human happened. When the little prince and princess took part in the procession at Wellington Arch, George appeared to pinch his sister, which caused Charlotte to let out a yelp in pain. It was small. It was quick. It was the kind of thing that happens in the back seat of a car on a long journey or at a dinner table when the adults are not watching closely enough. But this time, every camera in the world was watching. MDB. Cheat sheet. What happened next is what made the footage stop people mid-scroll and refused to let them look away. Camilla could be seen pointing her finger and turning to gesture toward Kate, who was standing behind her. According to a lip reader who analyzed the footage, Camilla told Kate, "Take her," while pointing down toward Princess Charlotte. Short, clipped, unmistakably firm. Not a question, not a gentle suggestion. A directive, the kind of instruction that does not wait for permission or negotiation. Royal Insider. I heart. Some royals reportedly thought it was just a moment of kids being kids, but Camilla was not among them. She reportedly gave Kate what observers described as the death stare before instructing her to take her daughter. The footage lasted only a few seconds, but in those few seconds, something invisible and significant was visible. The moment shows exactly how much pressure the royals were under, as they juggled the intense grief of saying goodbye to the Queen with the spotlight of global attention. Cheat sheet. Newsweek. Body language experts who reviewed the footage noted the speed and decisiveness of Camilla's turn. One body language expert noted that Camilla's movements indicated there was more than meets the eye, that while she likely had complex feelings surrounding Queen Elizabeth's death, the funeral demanded a certain kind of composure and control. Another analyst noted that while Camilla's expression was not cruel or cold, it carried a weight of command that was unmistakable. In those seconds of footage, you could see the hierarchy of the moment, and Camilla was at the top of it. She had stepped into her new role without hesitation, and the sharp turn of her head and the finger pointed toward Charlotte showed a woman who now understood exactly what her position gave her. Nikki Swift. Kate reportedly was not entirely comfortable with receiving instructions from Camilla regarding Prince George and Princess Charlotte. It had been previously reported that Kate had told Charles and Queen Elizabeth that she would not be rushed when it came to how she raised her children. Whether that history informed the expression on Kate's face in those seconds of footage is something the cameras could only hint at. But she reached for Charlotte, steadied her, and the moment passed. The surface returned to calm. The procession continued. Marie Claire and Prince William stood nearby, watching. At the time, the moment did not go unnoticed on social media. One person wrote, "Looks like Prince George and Princess Charlotte have a small disagreement. Look at the Queen Consort, Camilla." Others chastised Camilla for stepping in. "Did you see Camilla berate Catherine over Charlotte at the Wellington Arch? Terrible," said one commenter. Others were more measured, arguing that Camilla was simply responding as a senior royal, that it was a practical instruction, not a personal attack, delivered in a moment when decorum mattered enormously. Some pointed out that every person in that procession was under extraordinary pressure, that no one gets through a day like that without some sharp edges showing, and that Camilla's reaction could have come from anyone in her position. Royal Insider. But the debate kept going. The footage went viral again months later on TikTok, being viewed over 1.1 million times, with a caption reading, "Camilla gesturing to Kate Middleton to stop Charlotte talking." The world kept returning to it, because it felt like a keyhole, a small opening through which you could see something much larger and much more complicated than a grandmother telling a grandchild's mother to handle a moment of sibling misbehavior. Newsweek. William's reaction in those seconds. is what many observers found most arresting. He is a man who has spent his entire life being watched. He has been photographed at christenings and funerals, at polo matches and charity events, in moments of joy and moments of devastation, since before he was old enough to understand what cameras were. He knows how to hold a face still. He knows how to let nothing land on the surface while the interior carries something entirely different. And in those moments near Wellington Arch, that stillness was on full display. Body language expert Judy James told a British publication that William has bent his own thoughts and personal feelings in favor of the institution. And Camilla, for that matter. His behavior toward Camilla is a choice he makes repeatedly and consciously for the sake of his family and the monarchy. That kind of ongoing, daily management takes something from a person. It takes discipline and intention and a very particular kind of love for something larger than yourself. And in moments of grief, when the guard comes down just slightly and the formality slips just a fraction, the effort sometimes becomes visible even when the person making the effort does not want it to be. The list. William is Diana's son. That is not a political statement. It is simply true, and it shapes everything. He grew up watching his mother carry a very specific kind of pain. He watched her navigate a marriage that was breaking from the inside while the outside world was told everything was fine. He watched her become one of the most beloved figures in modern history, even as the institution around her struggled to hold her. And he knew, in the way that children always know even when adults believe they are shielded from it, who the other woman was during those years. Camilla and Queen Elizabeth had spent years on rocky footing, but by the time the Queen's Platinum Jubilee rolled around in 2022, the Queen had made it clear she wanted Camilla to be known as Queen Consort once Charles took the throne. Their relationship had genuinely improved over time, with the two women bonding over a shared love of horses and other common ground. But none of that history erases the longer history. And William has lived inside all of that longer history, in a way that no public statement can fully address or fully resolve. The list. The road to becoming Queen Consort was a challenging one for Camilla, stepping into a role she had not been raised for and had not spent most of her adulthood preparing for. But at the funeral, something in her posture and her manner showed a woman who had arrived, who was no longer waiting to be accepted or accommodated, but who was operating from the center of the institution she had long been kept at the edge of. The list. According to communication coach Sonia Beldam, Camilla's posture and facial positioning during the funeral displayed just how much she had come to admire the late monarch. Her body language did most of the talking during those days of mourning, and in a way that perhaps surprised even her most critical observers, what it said was something like readiness, not coldness, not triumph, not the caricature that her harshest critics had always painted, but readiness, the posture of a woman who had waited a long time to occupy a role fully, and who now intended to occupy it completely. The list. After the funeral, the Queen's coffin proceeded from the Abbey to Windsor, where she was buried in St. George's Chapel alongside her late husband Prince Philip, with whom she had shared 73 years of marriage. The crown, scepter, and orb were removed from the top of the coffin in a final, formal act of separation, the last moment when Queen Elizabeth was Queen Elizabeth in the official sense, with all the symbols of sovereignty resting above her. Then they were placed on the altar, and she was simply herself, a woman, a mother, a grandmother, being laid to rest among the people she had loved. Fox News. King Charles III stood by during those moments and appeared teary-eyed. Whatever weight the crown had always carried, it had never felt heavier than it did in those seconds at Windsor. What the world was left with, after all the cameras had packed up and all the world leaders had returned to their own countries, and all the flowers outside Buckingham Palace had been gathered and composted, was a strange and complicated feeling. There was grief, yes. Deep, genuine, widespread grief for a woman who had been a constant in the lives of not just one nation but many. But there was also a quiet awareness that something had shifted, that the world that existed before September 8, 2022, was not coming back, and that the world that came after it was going to be shaped by people and dynamics and relationships that were still very much in motion. Camilla's sharp turn at Wellington Arch was not a scandal. It was not a crime. It was not even by itself particularly remarkable. But it was a window, and what people saw through it, a new queen consort operating with the full authority of her position, a Princess of Wales navigating the complicated terrain of family hierarchy in public, A Prince of Wales holding his face carefully still while something moved behind his eyes, told a story about the royal family that no official statement could have delivered more honestly. Queen Elizabeth II had spent 70 years making that kind of composure look effortless. She had spent decades holding the weight of the crown so steadily that people sometimes forgot it was a weight at all. And in her absence, the people around her were learning, in real time, in front of the world, what it meant to carry something that large without her at the center of it. The Queen was gone. But in the gray morning light outside Wellington Arch, in a moment that lasted less than 10 seconds and said far more than anyone had expected, the lesson she had lived by was already being carried forward, imperfectly, humanly, but unmistakably forward. Whether that was a comfort or a warning depended entirely on where you were standing.